I'm Steve Duprey. I think I know everybody here. I've got a little bit of a croaky voice from laryngitis. Some of you may say that's a good thing. But I think Carlos has given you the outline of this, but part of the reason, there were 702 applications submitted to the Federal Department of Transportation under this. 42 were selected. $5 billion was requested. They had $500 million to hand out. We got about 1% of it. It's extraordinarily competitive, and it really is a testament to a great application. We had a lot of help from Governor Lynch, Senator Shaheen. A whole delegation was supportive. We lobbied hard for it, and part of what made the application attractive to the Department of Transportation was the fact that we were going to have private investment as well. Now, I'm going to just tell you, as a property owner, and all of you probably have property in Concord, depending on how you draw the circle, about 15% of Concord's tax base is in this little golden mile. If the tax base improves and gets better, the rest of us keep our property taxes at a somewhat reasonable level. If the Main Street deteriorates the way many Main Streets have, then of course that tax burden gets spread further. So as a business person, I want a vital Main Street. Beyond that, I think everybody in this room in their careers has run into Lou Feldstein and the work at the Charitable Foundation, but he's written some great books about what social capital is and how communities work. One of the remarkable things I think about Concord is that we have a great sense of community. One of the reasons we do is we're not only Concord's Main Street, we're Loudoun's Main Street, Bow's Main Street. This is a Main Street for a couple 100,000 people. And it's literally seeing people on the street, people coming down to an event here or going to something on the State House lawn that helps create that kind of social capital so our community functions better. So from a very selfish point of view, because I've got a lot of mortgages and have to live a long time to pay them off, I want to see Main Street thrive. And part of what made the application very attractive was we're going to approach the private sector for investment in this. There are a bunch of different ways the city's looking at doing it, including special assessment districts and everything else, but one way to help lessen that burden of a special assessment or some other mechanism was to go out and apply to the CDFA. I think all of you have known the CDFA was started under John Sununu under a very complex structure that failed and didn't work. Judd Gregg, who hardly ever mentions it, we were successful in convincing Judd Gregg at that time to take $3 million out of the state general coffers, which was not popular because we were in the last big recession. And I remember Stan Arnold, the Department of Revenue Commissioner, saying, "Over my dead body." He did fine. He survived it. But I argued to Judd Gregg that it was a very Republican small R concept. We let the taxpayer actually decide where their money goes. And that's essentially what you're doing with the CDFA. In your brochure, after years of practice, they've got it down to a remarkably simple 2 sheets. But let me give it to you like this. Basically, everybody in this room who has a for-profit business is paying business enterprise tax. Half of 1%, is that what it is now? Or 3/4?
3/4.
At 3/4 of 1% on your payroll. There we go. We've got our accounting firm, Nathan Wexler, here. They keep me out of trouble more often than you know. So you pay 3/4. And if you have any business profits tax, you obviously pay the business profits tax. And if you're in the insurance business, you pay the insurance premium tax. That's the deal. You pay that tax. Welcome to New Hampshire like any other state. Instead of sending your check to the state of New Hampshire and letting the 424 legislators decide what to do with it, if you use the CDFA program, you get to direct it to the project you want, whether it was Friendly Kitchen, whether it was Red River Theater. It's a remarkable thing. You get to say where your tax dollars go. So here's on $1,000 how it works. On $1,000, instead of sending your $1,000 business profits tax to the state of New Hampshire, you're going to send a check to the CDFA. They will invoice you. They're very good about that. Very, very diligent about that. You give them a pledge agreement first and say, "I'll give $1,000." That pledge is binding. Okay. They will then invoice you. When they invoice you and you send your check in, they will then send you a form that gets attached to your tax form where you get a credit for 75% of that business profits tax. So instead of owing the state that $1,000, you only own 25% of that. Now, because you've made your check to the CDFA, which then in turn hands it to a tax-exempt entity, depending on your federal tax bracket, you're going to get a federal tax donation for that other 25 cents or $250. So depending on your tax bracket, a $1,000 contribution to this project is going to cost you anywhere from $110 to $180. It's the best leveraging you'll ever get on money. And when we set up the CDFA, and actually was set up when a lot of the banks were struggling in the late 80s, and they had way too much Oreo property they'd taken back, and it was a great way for banks to get rid of property without having to put it on the market. And I think the CDFA, we bought 250 homes from banks and then recycled those out to not-for-profit housing groups. The first downtown project we did was Keene. If any of you remember what Keene looked like in 1987, 88, 35% of the storefronts were empty. They had issued vehicular traffic issues. Property values had declined fairly substantially, and we invested and did their whole downtown. It was one of the largest CDFA projects at the time, and did the Colonial Theater. Now they have less than a 5% vacancy, even in this recession. The values have gone up far beyond the rate of inflation. It works. Littleton just did theirs over and had to suffer through the reconstruction while during the summer season, while that is the main route for traffic. We've got some other options. So I'd be glad to answer any questions. We get to the question and answer period, but if any of you have a tax liability of BET or BPT and you're not using it, whether it's this project or another one, shame on you. You'd rather let the legislature hand out the money than you decide? Plus, you give a $100,000 donation and you can take that over 5 years, okay? So if you don't have enough business profits tax, you're gonna pay that in over 2 or 3 years depending on the grant award from the CDFA. But you can pay that over, take that over 5 years. So it's an incredible way to take an $11,000 or $17,000 donation and essentially mark it up and get credit for a $100,000 donation.
Steve,
Yes.
could you just speak a little bit to how CDFA might work for a nonprofit? You know, when you talk about getting credit against your BPT and your B.
You know, I don't believe that. I don't think not-for-profits pay a BET, so it's really worthless. Right?
I think in one of the meetings, one of our initial meetings, we were talking about going out to nonprofits. We got corrected in that respect. If most nonprofits are 501c3 nonprofits, and they pay none of those taxes. So my letter went out to a few folks that it shouldn't have gone out to.
Although, the good news or bad news, depending on your point of view, there is discussion in the legislature about making the BET applicable to not-for-profits as a source of revenue. So, hang on. How many of you like gambling now? Just kidding, little joke. Mary?
When we make the application, will these tax credits be applicable to 2013 or 2014 or what years?
What happens is the application is going to go into the CDFA in April. Is it this year? April? Yeah, and they'll make a decision by June. And they juggle it depending on the number of applications they're funding. They can go, like when they did the Grupponi Conference Center, the credits were awarded over a 4-year period. Now, that's very unusual now. It's usually 1, 2, once in a while, they'll stretch it out over 3 years. Obviously, it's easier for the group trying to solicit the donations if you have the longer period. The most likely is you'd have to pay them over 2, but you'll know that.
But if it is 2, would it be 13 and 14, or would it be?
It'd be 13 and 14. Okay. But remember, we work on the state's fiscal year, which is July 1 to June 30. Every major project, the ones Carlos mentioned, but in addition, families in transition. You look up and down the state, it wasn't intended to become the business finance authority for the not-for-profit community, but virtually every major project, whether it's New Hampshire Public Radio, I think the Food Co-op got some here in town. I know the Historical Society did years ago, the Palace Theater, the Nashua Performing Arts Center, the Music Hall, the 3S Art Space in Portsmouth. I don't think the Courier did. The Institute of Art has in the past. The Red Cross, the Boys and Girls Club, the new Nashua Y. I mean, because what it does, it allows those of you who are in business who have a tax liability to say where your tax dollars go instead of letting the legislature do it, which is, I think, is a tremendous idea. Any day, but these days particularly. Any questions? If you have any, we can get a CDFA person to answer them, but it's a pretty thorough explanation here, and there's a worksheet, pretty simple.